Statement, the Glastonbury Festival and BBC coverage, Secretary of State Lisa Nandy.
With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to make a statement about the events at Glastonbury this weekend. Members of Parliament will have seen, as I have, the appalling and unacceptable scenes at Glastonbury on Saturday, where chants of death to the IDF and river to the sea, amongst others, were broadcast to the nation. I've been in touch with my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, as to whether there has been any criminal offence committed. The House will know that decisions relating to specific cases are an operational matter for the police. Avon and Somerset Police have confirmed that video evidence is being assessed by officers to determine whether any offences may have been committed. They have just announced in the last few minutes that this has now taken the form of a criminal investigation. So, as I hope members will appreciate, it therefore would not be appropriate for the government to comment on an ongoing investigation at this stage. But let me be clear that this government will not tolerate anti-Semitism. It has no place in our society. It is a poison and a cancer that must be rooted out, and we will be relentless in our work to do so. This government works closely with the police and with community partners to ensure the safety and security of Jewish communities, and we will continue to do so following the enormous impact that these events have had on them over the weekend. Let me turn now to the role of the BBC. On Saturday afternoon, just after the broadcast, I called the Director General to ask for an explanation and what immediate steps the BBC leadership intended to take. As the Prime Minister said yesterday, it is essential that the BBC explains how these scenes came to be broadcast. The BBC has rightly apologised and took the immediate decision not to put this content on iPlayer. I welcome that. However, key outstanding questions remain, including why this performance was broadcast live, given the concerns regarding other acts in the weeks preceding the festival, why the feed wasn't immediately cut when the chants of death to the IDF began, and what due diligence was done prior to the decision to broadcast this particular act to the nation. I expect answers to these questions without delay. I have made that view clear to the BBC leadership, and I will, of course, update the House as soon as I can. Over the weekend and this morning, I have also had conversations with members of the Jewish community, including those who were present at Glastonbury. They have raised a number of concerns about imagery and slogans that were on display at the festival this weekend. And I am told that this led them to establish their own safe space at the festival. As a government, we take this incredibly seriously. We are urgently looking into the specifics of these alarming reports and reaching out to the festival organisers. Finally, I want to be clear about the government's role. As a government, we strongly support freedom of expression, and as Culture Secretary, I will robustly defend the independence of our broadcasters and the right to artistic expression. But we do not accept that incitement to violence, hate speech or anti-Semitism is art. There is a clear difference between speaking out for Palestine, which is the right of everybody in this House and everybody in our country, and anti-Semitism, which is not and which will never be. When the rights and safety of people and communities are at risk, and when our national broadcaster fails to uphold its own standards, we will intervene. In the coming days, I will be having further conversations with the BBC and festival organisers to ensure that lessons are learnt and action is taken, and I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State Stuart Andrew.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Secretary of State for her statement and for advance sight of it, and for her tone. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have always been a strong advocate for the BBC. It is a cornerstone of British public life with a proud history of cultural contribution. The events of this weekend, however, have made this incredibly difficult. During the coverage of the festival, the artist, as we've heard, real name Pascal Robinson Foster, led the crowd in a chant of death to the IDF, a moment which extraordinarily was transmitted by the BBC. Let me be clear, a national broadcaster funded by the licence payers must adhere to the highest standards of impartiality, responsibility and commitment to social cohesion. And I hope we can all agree that in this instance it has failed profoundly. Free speech and political activism are the sign of a healthy democracy, essential to it. But when you cross the line to incitement to violence, then there must be a consequence. However, broadcasting is not a passive act. Every second of broadcast transmitted is an active choice. Airing Robinson Foster's hateful rhetoric wasn't just a lapse in editorial judgment. It was a disgraceful affront to the Jewish community and a violation of the BBC's own public charter and to entertain without undermining the fundamental values of our society. As the Secretary of State said, let us be clear that hateful rhetoric should never be cloaked as artistic expression. But it also raises fundamental questions about the BBC's institutional culture. This is a broadcaster that has time and again given airtime to representatives and supporters of Hamas while refusing to clearly identify the group as what it is, a terrorist organisation. It has repeatedly failed to call out anti-Semitic rhetoric when it emerges under the guise of political commentary, and has faced serious allegations of minimising attacks on Jewish communities. The BBC's decision to also broadcast material from NECAP, a group whose members have openly called for members of Parliament to be killed, is as indefensible as it is shocking. We have already seen the devastating consequences of political violence in this country, with the loss and the tragic murder of Joe Cox and Sir David Amess. For the BBC to amplify voices advocating similar violence is grossly irresponsible. Even more troubling is that a leading member of the group is currently facing a terrorism charge. That fact alone should have prompted an immediate editorial intervention. Instead, the BBC gave this group a platform on a publicly funded service. I welcome the fact that the Secretary of State has spoken to the Director General, and I'm grateful to her for coming to the House to report on that exchange. However, I would like to press her further to ensure the gravity of this matter is fully recognised. Is she satisfied with the BBC's explanation that they originally decided that streaming the performance was in line with their editorial guidelines, and have now decided they will look at their guidance around live events so they can be sure teams are clear on when it is acceptable to keep output on air? Does she think the BBC's editorial guidelines were not clear enough, or does she think that the BBC misinterpreted them in the first place? And does she think that this sort of weak response will be of cold comfort to the Jewish community? I welcome the fact that she has spoken to the Home Secretary, and I wonder if she could also assess whether the BBC's actions constituted a breach of Section 22 of the Public Order Act. And does she believe the BBC's current editorial oversight mechanisms are adequate, specifically across the commercial broadcasting arms like BBC Studios? And does she think it is still right that the BBC gets to mark its own homework in the first instance before Ofcom get involved, and that an independent inquiry is what is needed? And in light of the repeated failings, will the government commit to a full review of the BBC's impartiality and governance standards as part of the Royal Charter renewal? And can she provide an update to the House on why the Charter renewal framework and Green Paper have not yet been published? Finally, can I thank her for her work so far? She will have the support of this side of the House, and I welcome her commitment to come back to the House to update us.
Thank you. I'm grateful to him, and I think all of those involved in the events of this weekend will hear the very strong feelings across all sides of this House, so I'm grateful to him for that. And I share his view about the importance of the BBC. I would say that those of us who do believe in the importance of our national broadcaster are probably more angry than anybody about what has happened over the last few days. It's precisely because we understand the importance of the BBC that we know that the BBC has to do better. He's asked whether I'm satisfied with the explanation that I've had so far. I'm not. I've been very clear with the BBC leadership about that, and clear that I expect to get a full explanation immediately without delay. He asked about the possibility of an independent inquiry. I would say to all members of this House that I'm not sure that you need an inquiry to establish that it should have been foreseeable that there would be problems with broadcasts this weekend, that the decision to broadcast live without any delay should have been reviewed, and that a live feed should have been pulled immediately when the chants death to the IDF began. So what I want to see from the BBC, and I know he shares this, is rapid action to make sure this cannot happen again. I've promised to update the House on these developments, but I should say too that I am still expecting a response from the BBC about an earlier decision to broadcast a documentary about Gaza, which it was then discovered fell short of the BBC's own editorial standards as well. So I expect a response quickly and swiftly, and I expect action as well. And finally, can I just thank him for mentioning the Jewish community, because having spoken to friends and colleagues across the Jewish community over the weekend, I cannot describe how much this has impacted on them, particularly those members of the Jewish community who were at Glastonbury. I was extremely distressed to hear that there were organisations whose logo was emblazoned very visibly on T-shirts and banners who are about to be prescribed by the government. I was concerned to hear reports that there were images associated with Hamas and others, and Nazi imagery as well. Most people who go to Glastonbury, I think, go for exactly the reasons that I've been in the past, and I suspect he has as well, because music festivals are an incredible way to bring people together, to show support and solidarity, to bind a nation and to showcase great British talent. And it is our job collectively to ensure that those festivals become again and remain a place where everybody in our country is welcome.
Gareth Snell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. As well as the despicable chants, the monologue that preceded them by the artist in question clearly drew on the influence of Jewish power in music, an age-old anti-Semitic trope. So could the Secretary of State say a bit more about what conversations she's going to have with the BBC on not just what they broadcast, but what was allowed to happen at Glastonbury? And will she also agree that those age-old anti-Semitic tropes, whether they're in Parliament, on stage or in public life, should be a red line for all of us?
Yes, and he has a very long history of standing up to anti-Semitism, including when it stained and sullied our own party, and I'm grateful to him for his leadership on this. I think those questions about what happens at Glastonbury are not for the BBC. There are serious questions for the BBC about what they broadcast and the decisions that they took. But I think there are wider questions about the sort of things that we want to see in our country. And I've been very clear as the Secretary of State that it is not for the government to try to determine what can be seen and what can be heard. But I do have a view about this as an individual. I don't want to see that sort of thing. I don't want to hear it, and I take great exception to it. And I think the Prime Minister was very clear on that point as well. It causes harm to people in the real world, and I have felt that very strongly this weekend. That's why this government is determined that wherever we see that form of anti-Semitism, including the appalling comments that he referenced that were targeted towards an individual in the music industry simply because they were Jewish, we will always stand up to that, and we will not hesitate to take action.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Max Wilkinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and we welcome the statement made by the Secretary of State. Sadly, Madam Deputy Speaker, rather than devoting our attention today to how this House can push for a just and sustainable resolution to the horrors of the conflict in the Middle East, we are talking about something else. On this occasion, and there have been past occasions too, this is deeply inappropriate language used by a shock-jock, attention-seeking musician and a public service broadcaster's apparent failure to fulfil its responsibility to uphold its own editorial standards. Bob Vylan's chants at Glastonbury this weekend were absolutely appalling. We can never accept hate-filled chants of death to anyone in our society at a music festival or anywhere else, and whatever the subject. It's right that there has been widespread condemnation, including from the organisers of Glastonbury Festival, and I associate myself and my party with those words. Of course, the UK must push much harder for a ceasefire. Of course, we must put pressure on Netanyahu's government to roll back their military campaign and build a sustainable two-state solution. And of course, Liberal Democrats believe that cultural events must be a place for debate. But there can simply be no place for hate speech, anti-Semitism and incitements to violence at Glastonbury or anywhere else. It seems that an editorial failing took place in the BBC's coverage. The decision to proceed with broadcasting this act is particularly hard to understand, given the BBC's correct decision to take a more cautious but ultimately fruitless approach to the broadcasting of Kneecap. A cursory look through the social media of Bob Vylan raises the question, how exactly was this not foreseen? And of course, we know that Kneecap is a group that in the past has called for death of the members of this House. The failure to effectively use delayed coverage and to remove the coverage in a timely manner is baffling. So can the Minister tell us whether, when asking the BBC about this issue, the subject of charter renewal was raised? And can she give us concrete reassurance that change will happen and we never have to put up with this kind of dreadful anti-Semitism appearing on our screens again?
Thank you. And can I thank him for his comments and for the tone in which he gave them? I think it's the responsibility of all of us, always, to stand up to anti-Semitism. I think it is sadly a battle that is never won. The lesson of history is that it falls to every generation to fight it and to fight it again. And certainly from our side of the House, I can promise that this government will always do that. But in relation to the specific question about the BBC and the subject of charter renewal, with apologies to my honourable friend for not addressing that earlier as part of his question, I haven't discussed charter renewal in the context of Kneecap and the other acts that were broadcast from Glastonbury this weekend. We have, of course, discussed charter renewal, and and it is absolutely right to say that editorial standards must be part of that discussion. When we release the terms of reference, which we're due to do shortly, that you will see a very clear, that everyone in this House will see a very clear commitment to that as part of the ongoing conversation that we will have about charter renewal. And can I finally say to him that I really welcome what he said about the death to anyone, and chants of death to anyone is not welcome in our society. But there was something particularly pernicious about chanting death to the IDF. Many colleagues will know that in Israel there is a conscription model. Every young person is required to serve in the IDF, which means that chanting death to the IDF is equivalent to calling for the death of every single Israeli Jew. That is why one of the many reasons why we take this so seriously, and why it cannot be argued that this did not cross a very dangerous line.
Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for her statement, and I share her concern that whilst freedom of expression must be protected, this incident raises serious concerns about the editorial standards and judgments exercised. And as a long-standing supporter of the BBC, I'm so deeply disappointed in it. So can I ask the Secretary of State what conversations she's having with the editorial team to ensure that a serious incident like this can never happen again?
Can I thank her for that, as well as speaking to the Director General of the BBC. On Saturday, a number of my officials have been in touch with the BBC's senior leadership team. We have put to them a series of specific questions which we expect immediate answers on, and we will continue to press very hard to make sure that they are forthcoming. I will, of course, update the House at the earliest opportunity, and I expect to be speaking to the Chairman of the BBC in coming days.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Caroline Dinage.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I refer you to my register of members' interests. Can I first of all thank the Secretary of State for that very strong statement, a very welcome statement on her behalf. The BBC editorial guidelines are actually on live streaming are actually quite clear. They say the level of monitoring should be appropriate for the likely content. A producer should normally be in a position to cut the feed from a live stream should it be necessary. So I wonder if the Secretary of State could say what explanation the BBC has given for why this live stream wasn't cut. Now, it can't be for lack of staff on the ground. They took a reported 400 people to Glastonbury at the weekend. What were they all doing? Absolutely. But for such a vast operation with simultaneous live shows all going out across various different parts of the site, I wonder if she's had the opportunity to ask the BBC, who has the final say on what bands are deemed suitable for live broadcast and why on earth they chose this one? And who makes the final decision when it becomes necessary to cut a live stream?
She asks typically a series of very important and relevant questions, some of which I have put to the BBC directly, but I will make sure that I ask all of those questions of them with a response expected as soon as possible. I think she's right to raise the question of what the number of staff who were present at the Glastonbury Festival or working on the broadcast were doing. But I do think this also raises very, very serious questions at the highest levels of the BBC about the operational oversight and the way in which editorial standards are understood and reflected in the decisions that are made by individual staff. This is a conversation that I've already had with the BBC board in relation to a previous documentary into Gaza, but it is a conversation that I will expect to be having with the board in the coming weeks as well.
And I refer to my register of interests as the chair of the BBC APPG and a former employee of Prospect and Bector unions, which represent BBC staff. I welcome my right honourable friend's statement and indeed the BBC's own statement today, which makes clear that the performers' anti-Semitic sentiments were utterly unacceptable and have no place on our airwaves, and that the BBC will examine its guidance on live events to ensure teams are clear on when it is acceptable to keep output on air. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that it is possible to express concern about the appalling suffering in Gaza without using language that risks fueling hatred and division or inciting violence?
I think he makes an incredibly important point. As somebody who's been associated with the Palestinian cause for nearly 2 decades now and has consistently spoken out about the treatment by the Israeli government, not just of people in Gaza, but in the West Bank as well, it is entirely possible to stand up for the Palestinians and never ever stray into anti-Semitism. And there are many members of this House who've managed to do precisely that over many, many years. Nobody is objecting to the comments that were made that said free Palestine. What everybody is objecting to is the comments that were made that were clearly anti-Semitic, incited hatred, and caused real-world harm to people living in our country in the Jewish community. So I couldn't agree more with him and support him on that. And for those who say this is a freedom of speech issue, this is nothing of the kind. This is about standing up against hatred, discrimination, racism in all its forms, but particularly anti-Semitism, where we have seen an enormous rise in our country in recent years, and where every single one of us needs to be vigilant to make sure that it is never allowed to spread.
Jim Allister.
Mr. Speaker, what we saw was an appalling pro-terrorist broadcast on our national broadcaster. Because when you chant, kill the IDF, you're endorsing those who kill them. And those who kill them are Hamas. So it was an endorsement of the terrorism of Hamas. And yet the BBC deliberately chose not to cut the broadcast. Perhaps therefore it's time for government to consider cutting the licence fee.
Well, this government's view of Hamas is clear. They are a terrorist organisation. They are banned in the UK, and there is a good reason for that, and we will continue to be outspoken about that and to be robust in relation to them. That is one of the reasons why I was very concerned to hear that there may have been imagery, symbols and graffiti in support of Hamas at the festival this weekend, and one of the reasons why we will not hesitate to make sure that we deal with that and get to the bottom of that in order to stand with our Jewish communities and with everybody in this country who stands against Hamas and is at risk from them. In terms of the BBC licence fee, he will know that this government supports the BBC. We believe it is an important institution. That is why we are so disappointed that this has happened, why we have been so exasperated with the lack of account from the leadership, not just about this, but about a previous Gaza documentary and a number of other issues as well. The BBC is one of the most important institutions in our country, and that is the reason why it is held to the highest of standards, why it's essential that we hold it to the highest of standards as we seek to start the charter renewal process, which should safeguard the future of the BBC, not just for the next 10 years, but to put it on a solid footing for decades to come. These are questions that we are determined as a government, collectively with the BBC and all members of this House, to grip.
Dr. Peter Prinsley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for her excellent statement. The murder of hundreds of Jews at the Nova Music Festival in October 2023 sparked this war. The irony of broadcast anti-Semitism at Glastonbury here in the UK is not lost on any of us. So how are Jews, such as myself, in this country to be reassured about the editorial processes at the BBC, and who on earth will be held accountable for this error?
He makes an extremely important point about accountability, and that is something that is not lost on me as the Secretary of State, and something that I've impressed upon the BBC leadership as well. When you have one editorial failure, it's something that must be gripped. When you have several, it becomes a problem of leadership, and so I very much take his point about that. On the point that he raises, though, about the parallels between, not the parallels, sorry, but the strength of feeling that people have about this, given that it was happening, this was a music festival, and it was at a music festival on the 7th of October where so many young people lost their lives, others kidnapped to never return to their families, and some still being held hostage. At that moment, this would have been the perfect place to express support, love and solidarity with those who are still suffering. And I know that there were those at the festival who were doing precisely that, but they were hindered in that by some of the appalling scenes that we've seen. And that's why we are determined to grip this and to make sure that music festivals are a safe and inclusive space for everybody. As a government, we're also reaching out to other music festivals and to Glastonbury to see what more we can do to express solidarity with those who are still suffering as a consequence of the appalling events that happened on the 7th of October, and to see what we as a government can do to support those efforts.
On Glenn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank Secretary of State for what she said? I agree with virtually everything she has said. When I heard these reports, I thought of the Mayor of Wilton, Councillor Alexandra Boyd, who is Jewish. And I thought about what it would have felt like for her to have watched this with her family. Can I say to the Secretary of State, I think we all in this place understand the fine editorial judgments that the BBC and their staff have to make. But this is of a completely different order. And when people are losing faith in the great institutions of this country, could I urge the Secretary of State in her follow-up conversations that the BBC actually identify accountability to individuals? My honourable friend has set out very clearly the guidance that exists. Somebody didn't follow that guidance, and I think the country expects people to be held individually to account for why they failed to do their job properly.
I think people do expect people to be held to account for the way that they do their jobs, be that on the front line or at senior levels. It's a point that I've made to the BBC. They will have heard what he said and what my honourable friend said as well about accountability, and it's a point that I will continue to press.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State has spoken about the responsibility at the BBC and of those who said these dreadful words. But could I ask her, what responsibility do those people who are organising the festival have, both legally and morally, to be held responsible and accountable, and to ensure it doesn't happen again?
Can I thank her for that? And I deliberately included some words about the festival itself in my statement, because I agree with her that we all have a responsibility to uphold the highest standards and to ensure that people are safe and welcome and included at our shared national events. The reports that I've had over the weekend and this morning are incredibly alarming. They suggest that that was not the case this weekend, and so we are reaching out to festival organisers and investigating those reports to make sure that that can't happen again.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So another week, another month, and once again the BBC has got it horribly wrong with their Glastonbury broadcast with regard to Hamas and with regard to anti-Semitism. And once again, another grovelling apology. How long, Secretary of State, must this go on before, regrettably, many in the Jewish community and millions of the British people conclude that the BBC is institutionally anti-Semitic?
Well, I was going to thank him for that suggestion, but I think his views about the BBC are very clear. Those of us who support the BBC, who believe it's an incredibly important institution, however, will know that it should and does, in some instances, play an important role for all communities to be heard and feel valued as part of our public life. That is the standard that we expect the BBC to be held to. That is the standard that this government will hold them to, and we will not hesitate to take the action that we need to make sure that it does rise to meet those standards.
Yeah.
Andrew Murison.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Congratulate the Secretary of State on her statement. Normalising, condoning, tolerating, the kind of things that we saw at Glastonbury over the weekend, history tells us never ends well. It ends extremely badly indeed. As a neighbouring MP, I have written twice to Worthy Farm with my concerns about kneecap, following reports of one of its members advocating the killing of MPs. No reply, none expected. Instead, it schedules Bob Vylan, who we heard also advocates killing people, this time Jews. Does the Minister agree that it is no good Glastonbury's very wealthy organisers banging on about their festival being a safe space for everyone, whilst it continues to facilitate operations like this?
Well, I share his concerns about how this was able to happen, and I am sorry to hear that he has had no response at all to very serious concerns raised in a capacity as a democratically elected Member of Parliament for people in the area who deserve answers. That's something I'm certainly happy to follow up on his behalf and with him after this statement. I share his view that festivals, music festivals in particular, must be safe and inclusive and welcoming spaces. And I fear that we fell way short on this occasion. I visited Glastonbury myself before. I know that it provides an incredible showcase for a lot of British artists, not just those at the top of their game, but up-and-coming British artists as well. But as the organisers rightly acknowledged, a line was crossed this weekend, and that must not be allowed to happen again.
Gregory Campbell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Secretary of State for her statement and the sentiments contained therein. But would you agree with me that in the run-up to the festival, it was very clear to many of us, given the track record of some of the participants, that this was going to happen or something like it was going to happen. The government were aware something was going to happen. The BBC were aware something was going to happen. And still it happened. Where does the sanction lie? And who is going to implement the sanction? And when are we going to know what it is?
Well, can I thank him for that? I mean, I agree very much with the sentiment that much of this was foreseeable. None of us could know precisely who was going to say what. But I think even a cursory glance at Google could tell you that this particular artist has a history of provoking very extreme statements and behaviour, particularly in relation to the events in the Middle East. I don't think it would have been too difficult to foresee that. And I think there are therefore serious questions to answer about the issues around live streaming, about due diligence and other factors as well. Those are questions I expect a response from the BBC on, and the action that they will take in order to ensure that this does not happen again. If those answers aren't forthcoming, I do have various levers in order to hold the BBC to account, and I want to be clear with him and with the House that I will not hesitate to use them if I need to do so.
Rankin. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Had those chants been calling for death to any other people, nationality, ethnicity, there is no question in my mind that that live feed will have been pulled straight away. I welcome the Minister's robust statement, but the problem is this is systematic, isn't it? There's been a decades-long and deep-rooted bias at the corporation against Israel, and the BBC has seemed unwilling or incapable to deal with it, hasn't it?
Can I thank him for that statement? And I really do feel the strength of feeling and the anger and the emotion that is contained behind what he says. I felt that from the Jewish community as well over the weekend, and actually from all of us, including myself, who feel very, very strongly that this should not be allowed to happen, and it certainly shouldn't be allowed to continually and repeatedly happen. As to whether there's a question of inbuilt bias at the BBC, I think what has happened here is a serious failing of editorial standards, leadership and oversight. It's that I need to make sure that we address, particularly because he said that if it had been any other group, it probably would have been pulled straight away. I'm not sure that we can say that with any confidence, actually, given that, as the chair of the Select Committee just made clear, there were hundreds of BBC staff involved in this production. The BBC was represented at Glastonbury at the most senior level, and yet the feed wasn't pulled and the standards weren't upheld. It's my job to make sure that regardless of which community it affects, that those standards are upheld, and I give him my word that I will use every lever at my disposal to make sure that that happens.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wish we lived in a world where there was no chanting of death. Any form of racism is vile, be that Islamophobic, anti-Semitism or any other kind. The Secretary of State will probably recall only last year in November the Israeli football fans which were chanting death to all Arabs, and more sickening perhaps, there are no schools in Gaza because there are no children. That kind of speech and chanting must equally be condemned. And what's sad is that whilst we have a ministerial statement here today, we did not have any ministerial statement when that chanting happened. It's the hypocrisy which is causing an outrage in the British public. Does the Minister not agree that that is what's happening out there in the community?
Could not disagree more. And I would just say to him that, of course, absolutely, and I think every member of this House will utterly condemn chants of death to all Arabs. It's disgusting and disgraceful. It's a principle by which we hold ourselves. And there is no hesitation from anybody in this House. The reason I've brought a statement to the House today is because our national broadcaster, which is funded by the licence fee, which is paid by the public in this country, has broadcast something that is deeply, deeply offensive to a community in this country, that has made many, many people feel, and may actually have made them, unsafe. That is the most serious thing that you can imagine. It is rightly a question for government, and that's why I didn't hesitate to bring it to the House today. If this had been a broadcast that had led with the chant that he describes, broadcast by the BBC, you would be having the same statement at this dispatch box, and you would be getting the same response from other members of the House. And can I just say to him that it does, as somebody who has stood up for the Palestinian cause for the last nearly best part of 2 decades in this House, especially when it was hard, and especially when it was unpopular, and especially when it cost me friends and colleagues, and has stood alongside many members of this House in order to highlight the plight of the Palestinian people. Can I just say to him that as a long-standing supporter of justice for the Palestinians, he does nothing for the Palestinian cause by aligning himself with anti-Semites.
John Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A blind man on a horse could see there was going to be difficulties broadcasting a band called Kneecap, named after a terrorist punishment. People who'd called for the death of people in this House, and we should take a moment here now to reflect on the fact that Eddie Neve and Ian Gow were both killed by Republican murderers. Is it not the case, however, that there is a pattern emerging here with the BBC, given the events of the weekend and given previous incidents, that will she at least test the idea that the BBC has a fundamental problem with Israel?
Secretary of State. Let me first of all recognise that the BBC has been criticised by all sides in this conflict for bias, which shows the very difficult editorial line that they have to walk. But let me also be clear that when it comes to what happened this weekend, as the BBC itself has rightly acknowledged, the coverage, the standards, the enforcement of those standards fell well short of what was expected. And let me acknowledge that that's not the first time in recent months that that's happened. Let me assure him that the government takes this incredibly seriously. We are having discussions with the BBC at the most senior levels in order to make sure that this is gripped. And as I said previously to other colleagues in the House, I do have levers at my disposal and I will not hesitate to use them should I need to.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think that anyone who witnessed the disgusting images of young, middle-class, educated morons chanting death to IDF soldiers at the weekend can only be alarmed that we've stooped to this level in our society. But even worse, the state broadcaster should then broadcast those images across the nation. And I welcome what the Minister has said today and the way in which she has said it. But if we look at what she has spoken about, she has called the Director, she has asked for immediate explanations, and she's expecting answers. But given that the BBC has already ignored calls from this House to explain its bias, does she really expect that she's going to get any satisfactory answers from an institution which is anti-Semitic, I believe, at its very core? And does she have any confidence in any police investigation, given that the police have already decided not to prosecute the member of NECAP who called for the killing of Tory MPs?
Well, the police have just announced in the last few minutes before we came into the chamber for this statement that there is now an ongoing criminal investigation. I think it's important that we allow the police to do their work. I, of course, wouldn't hesitate to call the Director General of the BBC and ask for an explanation. I do expect that explanation to be forthcoming. I expect it to be satisfactory, by which I do not mean that I expect excuses about what has or has not been done in this instance. What I expect is a full and honest explanation of what has clearly gone wrong on this occasion, and a full explanation of what will be done, not through another review, not with months and months of delay, not by spending public money on trying to get to the bottom of what has gone wrong, but what will be done immediately to make sure that this cannot happen again.
Point of order, Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State, in answering my question, said towards the end that I did no favours to the Palestinian cause by aligning myself to anti-Semites. Now, at no stage have I said in my question or statement that I was aligning myself to anyone at that Glastonbury event. So will the Secretary of State clarify what she meant? And if she didn't mean that, then I apologise, but I'd like some clarity on that.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order, which in fact was not a point of order, and I do not intend to allow the debate to continue via points of order. I'll allow a few moments for the front benches to swap over.